Even though there is a strong spiritual and/or extraterrestrial component to what has happened to me, there is also a quote-unquote conspiracy that is human-based. This video is about what I have to support the idea that there really is a man-orchestrated conspiracy that really has focused on me at times. This is the relevant information I have for anyone who is investigating these matters, along with some backstory in order to place these events in reality. Okay. I had a manic episode at the beginning of 1997 when I was 17. I was on a very high dose of antidepressant, which I was taking for a headache condition. Yes, that was quite a mistake. No one thought enough to realize that the antidepressant was the main reason why I went manic. I was extremely energetic and euphoric. My parents got scared. I was taken to a mental hospital where I was basically abused, mostly by medication, but also by what I believe now to be a mind control experiment. This was in Dominion Hospital in Falls Church, Virginia, which I believe to be also an Illuminati training facility. I'll get to that later. The psychiatrist there was a man by the name of Gary Spivak. I'm not sure if he was involved with the experiment that was taking place, but I do remember him being a smug asshole. Anyway, for some reason, as I walked down the hall of that mental hospital, I couldn't turn left. I was simply unable to turn my body in the direction of my left side, even though I was able and even prone to turn right. I couldn't physically sit down. I always had to pace, and I was only able to pace a certain way. I didn't suspect mind control at the time. I was too distracted by the dramatic turn of events in my life. This was not tardive dyskinesia, in case you are wondering. I did the research. In the 3 years between my first and second manic episode, there were a few little occurrences where it seemed like the conversation had been scripted, or where people seemed aware of something that I wasn't. In the early summer of 2000, I had a mini spiritual awakening. This was met with resistance and questions about my medications. I got very angry and went down a bad road mentally. There was an altercation with my parents. I thought they were the heads of a conspiracy. I ran out the door and was chased by my mom, who was a very nice person but seemed to be almost demonic at the time. Suddenly my entire life had been a prison, and I had just broken out of that prison. I walked to various houses trying to put the pieces together. I know that sounds vague. I thought I was being tested. I thought it was part of the test when the father of a kid I was trying to see wouldn't let me into his house. I pushed my way in, and he called the police. The police approached me outside the house as my back was turned. They immediately wrestled me to the ground, tied my wrists and ankles together, then drove me to the hospital and literally carried me inside. As I lay on the table, strapped in 4-point restraints, I was convinced that my life was a movie and that now it was over. In my mind, I was about to be released, and there was about to be a huge party for me. The doctor who came in and talked to me was obviously not a nice person. He was offended by me simply not understanding something he said. Our conversation made me afraid. This was in Suburban Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland. The doctor's name was Dr. Swan. After a few minutes, I started to relax. I was motionless on the table and not excited or agitated. Then Dr. Swan showed up at the foot of the door with a syringe in his hand, obviously to intimidate me. He purposely made me fearful at that moment, and after having been injected with a tranquilizer before, and after suffering like I had 3 years earlier, I basically thought that this would be a fate worse than death. I panicked and struggled in the restraints. I screamed. The doctor ignored this and proceeded to inject me. I woke up the next morning, seemingly a moment after passing out on the table. It was as if I had not dreamt at all. I was feeling pretty good, actually. I realized that the fantasy I had on that table was not true. I got a lot of anger out of my system. I learned something, but the world I was about to enter into was not what I expected. Immediately as I walked onto the floor of that psych ward in Suburban, I noticed the messages, both in physical actions and in words spoken out loud by both staff members and by patients. Most everything seemed to have something to do with me. I remember a staff member at her desk answering the phone by saying, "A Markoff." the first letter of my first name followed by my last name. I brought this to the attention of my social worker, who said that was impossible. On the floor of that ward, I met a man who went by the name Frank Kenzik. He was either severely afflicted and psychotic, or he was a conspiracy crony who was just pretending to be. He was either a conspiracy crony or he was pretending to be afflicted and psychotic. The first time I looked at him, he randomly blurted out the name of the kid whose house I had forced my way into the night before. Keep in mind that this is a stranger who had supposedly been on the ward when that happened. Frank Kenzik would go from calculated and cool. He would go from being calculated and cool to someone who yells nonsense, which he would repeat over and over again. He was often jotting down notes, and he managed to get me intensely interested in what he was writing. He was constantly hinting that something was about to happen and that I would be informed as to the nature of the conspiracy. He would look up from the page in front of him, and I would look where he looked, thinking maybe that a secret agent would walk into the room of the ward. Nothing would happen, and then he would write something else down and fool me again. He coerced me into writing a letter to, I believe, the Attorney General at the time. In case someone out there cares, that letter was dictated to me by Kenzik. Okay. I took some of Kenzik's jottings home with me. The style of the writing in form and in tone resembles that of the anthrax letters. Frank, in my opinion, was possessed by a demonic entity similar to what had possessed Bruce Ivins. These forces were involved with what really happened on 9/11. I recently sent the remainder of Kenzik's notes to the Department of Justice, along with a brief letter. While at Suburban, I met a man who was named Dan. I've forgotten his last name. He told me he was 27 when I asked him what his age was. This was 10 years ago. This guy also basically wouldn't speak to me directly. Dan had a photographic memory. He was able to draw an extremely detailed picture of my face met by a stream of various objects. It seemed like a computer-generated image. He did this without looking at me, and he did it quickly. This same guy was in the same hospital as me later on that summer. We were placed in different wards, though, in that hospital. This hospital, where we were placed in different wards, is called Shepherd Pratt in Baltimore, Maryland. When I was being carted through the halls of this hospital, strapped to a gurney, I noticed in one hallway that the doors were marked with the name Eve, followed by a number, as in past a door marked Eve 3, followed by a door marked Eve 4. There's an episode of the show The X-Files where a group of Eves are clones of each other, raised in an environment that is separate from society. Shepherd Pratt is a huge facility. My ward was only a small section of the building. I remember what happened in this hospital with the Eves thing. I believe the hospital has assisted in genetic modification experiments. My psychiatrist there was Dr. Carlos Escarate. When my case was being reviewed before a judge, Escarate made up a story about me telling him that I am omnipotent, among other things. I believe that he lied in order to convince the judge and others that I was crazy. I wasn't given the opportunity to respond. Instead, I was asked if I thought the Secret Service was conspiring against me, and I said that they were. No. Now I know that they weren't and still aren't conspiring against me, but I do know that they know who I am. Anyway, I'm not sure if the fact that this case review is recorded has any significance.